see this intriguing little blue marble floating around in space. And one of the most remarkable things that we find over there, this kind of self-replicating structure, DNA. This is very nice that the music now stops, so I use a short break. So, here we are at this planet with this self-replicating structure, and that's called life. And this is something I want to discuss with you today about migration, acculturation processes, because migration is one of the core elements of life. Hi, welcome. You know what this is? What you see here?
Not yet.
Not yet? But there are plenty of screens, I would say. It's a double helix of DNA representing life. And I was just telling that the essence of life is that it's, one of the essences of life is that it's migrating. It's always looking for better circumstances to thrive. Whatever type of life you look at, it's always on the move. And it's always looking for conditions which are beneficial for copying this DNA. And in this perspective, I would like to mention that we have in Dutch the word gelukszoeker when you talk about migration. And it's often, it's the happiness seeker, or sometimes also said the economic refugee. You know what I'm talking about. And I think it's very important to realize that all life is looking for happiness. That's a very fundamental law. Here we see a flock of birds looking for happiness. This is migration. Of course, when the weather is getting colder, we see, for example, the goose flying over, migrating from Siberia to warmer areas over here, or even more to the south. So, in the animal kingdom, migration is something that you basically see on a daily basis. What's also very fascinating to see is that these processes often happen in a group, right? It's the individual and the group. They're rather loud, these birds, right? So, I think it's very important to start from the idea that migration is a very, very natural principle, and it also applies to humans, of course. And here's a small map which tries to capture the history of mankind concerning the origins and how we as a species spread and migrated all over this planet. It starts with the invention or the emergence of modern man here in the east side of Africa, and then you can see how the population spread over the planet. And what's very interesting, of course, to see is here on the top with the Bering Sea, you realize that in those days that the sea level was significantly lower. So it was possible for people to cross the Bering Strait and in this way to populate the Americas. If we go to a more recent picture of migration, then we see an interesting new opportunity for migration. Anybody have an idea why this picture is different?
Starting point is different, right?
The starting point is different? In what respect?
Yeah, before it was from the Middle East and
Yeah.
then it spread all over the world, and now it just
Yeah.
the Europe.
Yeah.
Almost all arrows are coming from.
Yeah.
Okay, China.
But there's one very interesting difference with this one.
The big sea travel.
Yes, exactly. Here you see the invention of sea travel, and what is a very fascinating one to see is that apparently the Europeans, the red lines, they invented sea trade pretty early on, and they made long trips. One of the secrets of, for example, the Dutch success in sea travels was the good cooks they had on board. That's new to you probably, right? But if you have good cooks aboard, that's good for the morale, it's good for the health. It's a critical element in making these kinds of discoveries and traveling all over the world. And even today, the Marines in the Netherlands have the best cooks in the army, just on the side. There's another very interesting thing that we see here. That's, for example, slave travel, right? It's over here in the Arab world, and of course, from the west coast of Africa, a lot of African people have been forced to migrate to North and South America. All made possible due to sea travel. And what is interesting to see is that whereas in the past we saw that these travels, if you look at time, this is 65,000 years ago, 60,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago. See, this is a very slow process over land, and slowly the species is traveling over the globe, adjusting slowly to circumstances. And also you see a kind of evolution and mankind adapting to circumstances. It's typically the slow process that you can witness. And if you want to have a very interesting book that describes the history of mankind on that, it's the book of Jerry Diamond, Guns, Germs and Steel. You read the book? It's marvelous, isn't it? I mean, it's a very nice history of the world, and it provides you with a perspective of why, for example, the Western economy has become so dominant as a culture on this planet. It's basically by accident. One of the reasons is that we live together with cattle, making ourselves very robust against diseases. So when, for example, the Spanish discovered basically the coastlines over here, and they encountered, for example, I believe it was a Maya civilization. They were, at the beginning, really surprised by these huge structures, these huge cities, and at the same time a very primitive civilization that was living there. What they didn't realize was when they arrived that the bacteria that they brought from Europe were traveling faster than the humans. So they encountered cities that had been very thriving 10 years before, but they had been decimated because of disease, and as a result there was a complete collapse of cities. There was barbarity, so to say, and when the Spanish arrived there, they had no clue that it was only a recent historic event. That's on the side. That tells a little bit about cultural connections. And this is, for me, a very relevant picture, especially being Dutch. Anyone recognizes what this is?
Maybe New York.
Yes?
I think they give away blankets that have disease.
Sorry?
No, it's a colonization of the America. It's like the Aborigines the tribes that used to live there
Yeah.
in this Europe and the
Yeah.
pilgrims.
Yeah, this is most likely Hudson, who is entering at this moment the island of Manhattan. And basically Hudson was appointed by the United East Indian Company of the Netherlands to find a short route to China. But, well, hey, there was a continent in between, the Americas. He bumped into on the island of Manhattan, and it was a fascinating place. You could have there agriculture, and there was a lot of beavers you could hunt for, and you could sell the furs. So they decided basically to start a kind of little fort over there that grew into what's now called Manhattan, New York. And actually, they bought, at least that was the Western colonists were thinking, they bought Manhattan for 25 euros from the indigenous tribes living there. And here starts a very fundamental problem, because the indigenous tribes living there, they had a completely different perspective on interacting with the environment. It was a different culture. And they had a completely different perspective on possession and the use of natural resources. In a way, you can say that they had a much more balanced way of interacting with the environment than the Europeans. I mean, the Europeans had a kind of industrialized society already. They have developed possession, capitalism, entrepreneurship, and with this kind of spirit, they came over there, wanted to possess land to make it, to have production on it. If you want to have production on it, you need to have ownership. So you see, the economy of Europe came into conflict with, to say, the economy of the indigenous people living over there. And I think even today you see that happening with the Dakota oil pipeline. And fortunately, I heard that yesterday, I believe it was decided by the American government, that the pipeline will not pass through the what is considered the holy land of the Indian tribes living over there. So a small victory between cultural clashes, and it demonstrates, in my opinion, that there's still some tension between those cultures. And if you want to understand these cultural clashes, these conflicts between different ways of looking at the world, or of ownership, it often boils down to inequalities on this planet concerning the access to water, food, and energy. If you try to make an inventory of all the conflicts that we had on this planet, all the wars, it usually is about water, food, and energy. That seems to be the history. So, knowing that, and having a little bit of an idea of what is currently happening with our climate system, if we look at the scenarios, then we can make a connection between climate, the resources, how they are spread on this planet, and the possible conflicts that can emerge as a result of these changes. Here's, for example, a picture. Anybody recognizes where it is?
Refugee camp.
Yeah? Yeah?
It could be either Kenya, like that, or Jordan.
This one is probably Jordan. It's associated with the Syrian conflict. And of course there's a lot of turmoil and discussions and, about this very, very, very complicated conflict in Syria. But there's one interesting publication that came out earlier this spring in Nature. And here a clear link is made between climate change and the spinning out of control of the Syrian conflict. Apparently, a series of droughts drove many farmers to the cities, bringing in the farmer culture in a city structure that was already under pressure. And as a result, the conditions were created for this conflict to basically start to spin out of control. So that's, for a lot of people, it's quite new to hear about that the Syrian conflict is related to climate change. But if you realize that most conflicts deal indeed with inequalities in the access to resources, then suddenly it starts to make sense that these processes happen. And then, if you look at a picture like this, this is of course a scenario of the next years to come. It's running up to 2050, and what it says basically is the decrease or increase of productivity in agricultural land. And you see in particular here in the region south of the Sahara a serious decrease in expected crops. Also in the north we see problems emerging. If there had been some pictures of say Spain, Italy, perhaps Greece, then you would see that this is not an African problem alone. It's basically a global problem, and you see how much changes are expected. You also see that there are areas on the planet that are likely to benefit, right? And that's also very important to keep in mind. I mean, it's very easy to only think about, oh God, we're all going to die. It's, the doom scenarios. But I think it's also very important to keep up an open mind for the new possibilities that emerge, right? I usually say more carbon dioxide is also beneficial for plants. Never forget that. It's not only a bad thing, there are also positive sides to climate change, and you all shouldn't forget about it because we probably are going to need them. So, this is basically the situation which is expected by science at this moment. So you can imagine this is likely to have a serious impact on migration patterns, right? This is quite serious. And this is, at this moment, the picture that you can draw from the big migration flows happening in Africa and Europe. And you can see the darker colored countries are experiencing an influx of people. So you see a lot of people going to Europe, but also here, these areas is a serious influx. We see an outflux of people from these regions. We also see an influx over here in Africa. Here's also an increase of population happening due to migration. So that's the aggregate picture of today of the main routes of migration. That's how people move these days. And this is what we see in the news. This is basically politics, because we have borders. And borders, if you fundamentally try to understand what a border is, there are many definitions of it. For me, personally, I usually describe it as a kind of filter. It's a filter to keep poor people out. Or it's a filter to protect your resources, to protect your water, your food, or your energy sources. It's about possession, to protect your economic system. And how to protect it? By fences, by having procedures, by having clear filters of who is allowed to enter for example, the United States or the European Union, and who is not allowed to enter. And guess what? What determines if you're allowed to enter? Any clue?
Nationality.
Nationality, yeah. Me as a Dutchman, I can travel free all over the world, basically. No problem for me. But for a lot of Africans, that doesn't apply. Why would there be a difference?
You're asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking you. Yes, I'm asking you.
Why would there be a difference? I mean, like, well, it's quite complex. I mean, it is ridiculous that the place where you are born essentially determines your access in the world. Like, it's a completely ludicrous idea, but unfortunately that's the way how it is.
It deals with possession, right?
Mm-hmm.
With fences or borders, of this is mine, and it's not yours. It's about possessions, how rich you are. And I can assure you, if you live in a country that's really very poor, but you are by accident very rich, that's very easy for you to have access to other rich countries. But if you're poor, then you are forced to do it like this. And this is the illegal migration that is happening, of course, everywhere. I mean, you build a wall and then people dig tunnels beneath it or they fly over it. And in that respect, such a wall is never closed. It's impossible. But it stops a lot of people. And I think that's also the idea. This is what we see in the Mediterranean. And whereas a lot of people are still crying these days when they watch the movie The Titanic, if we look at the statistics, we know that each year a couple of Titanics are sinking at the Mediterranean right now. And I can tell you, these circumstances during the trip were not as good as during the Titanic aboard, until the last moment, of course. Here we see the statistics of people that are drowning in the Mediterranean. And you see a kind of seasonal effect, of course, but you see it runs in the thousands. It's really a lot. And whereas we are very keen as politicians and people who have an influence on it, or scientists or whatever, to look at the statistics, ultimately this is what we're dealing with, right? And I remember when this picture came out, that it splitted discussions. On the one hand, that people were saying this is terrible, this poor little kid, and there were other people saying, yeah, God, but his father was already in a kind of safe situation, and why? I believe he was a hairdresser or something, and he tried to flee from Turkey to Europe. So was that really necessary? Well, you can think about all kinds of reasons to think, well, who is to blame? But ultimately, this is the state of our civilization right now. And I think we can all agree that this is not something that we as humanity can be proud of. That's the bottom line, I think. So we have a challenge, I think, as a humanity to improve ourselves to how we deal with our own species, but also with the rest of the species we share this planet with. This is currently what we can see as a response to what is happening with migration in Europe. We're increasingly polarizing about how to deal with migrants. And this whole migration issue is so bloody complicated, and it's so tempting to look at it from a simple perspective, because simple answers are easy to communicate, and it gives some kind of safety feeling, right? If we only close down the walls, then we would not have those refugees that are threatening our very existence. I mean, how many terrorists are among them, right? We have to close it right now. Donald Trump was saying, hey, if you have 100, how do you call them, Skittles, those he would call them M&Ms, and there are only 2 of them are poisoned, would you eat the whole basket? That's one way of framing it, right? And then people from the other side say, well, every human is a human, right? There's no such thing as that you do not have access to our country. We have to share this planet. Everybody is welcome. And people who do not agree with us are basically fascist swine or the new type of Nazis. Huh? How can you think so racist about other people and not letting them in? So you can see that this debate is really becoming nasty, and people find it increasingly difficult to try to understand the motives and perspectives of the other party. And I think it's of crucial importance to keep this discussion going on, because the more a society drives apart, the more dangerous the situation gets, and that we lose our own civilization. So that's one of the things that really drove me together with Rocco Paolillo to work on a simulation model to try to explore a little bit the dynamics of this situation, to see, well, what kind of story can we create, or how can we communicate the complicated dynamics with migration to help fuel this discussion a little bit more, to make people, to give them the opportunity of playing around with the model and experience what is happening actually. And we just have this interview in HP de Tijd about this whole polarization that is happening about all kinds of topics these days. We have the Ukraine referendum. We of course have the Black Pete discussion going on in the Netherlands. We have the migration issue. Oh man, we're so polarized. Come on, I'm getting tired of this. So, that's why I thought it might be a good idea to understand this phenomena as an emergent property, as an emergent phenomenon. And I will not give a complete lecture on social complexity, although I'm very tempted to do that. But I have something I want to show you that is very deep about how life operates, how our species operates, and it starts with ants.
You are watching the Nova Video Podcast.
What I'm doing in this experiment out here in the field with a fire ant colony is putting baits on a blank piece of paper, one next to the colony itself, and then another bait at the end of our little platform of paper, a little distance from the nest, so the ants can't find it right away. What I'm doing here is holding a fire ant that I've just taken out of the nest, and I'm going to squeeze the rear end of the abdomen, where the sting is, that contains the trail substance that the ants use to lay down on the ground and guide other fire ants to food and new places for nesting. And I'm going to duplicate this by just taking out some of that material from the rear end of the ant. And then I'm going to lay my own trail and talk to the ants to lead them where I want them to go.
And you see them migrating, right?
And yeah, it's going to work. And now, just a few minutes later, after I laid my trail, the ants themselves are laying their trail on top of that, and the result is a very strong trail, and quite a few ants now are going back and forth, and they'll go that they'll do that for hours until they collect all that food.
So basically, what we see here is the importance of communication. Basically, if an ant, or in this case the professor of Harvard, and he put some pheromone trail communicating that there is food over there. And that is clear to the other ants, and the other ants follow this signal, discover the food, return to the nest, and when they return to the nest, they also leave behind this trail of pheromone. So more pheromone is building up. And the more pheromone there is, the more attractive, the more visible this route is for the other ants. So you get a kind of self-amplifying process going on. And that's about the emergence of collective phenomena. This principle can also be applied to, for example, opinion dynamics, where if you have a radical opinion, that it's a signal to other people that want to follow that signal, and they grow towards a particular group opinion. And that can go one way, it can go another way, it can go two ways, you can have a conflict, but I think it's very interesting to understand these phenomena as emergent. If you understand the principle of emergent phenomena, it's very interesting to, for example, look at the rise of the Nazis in the previous century as an emergent property. How did that work? It's not that they suddenly had the idea, we're going to do it like that, but it's better to understand these processes in terms of growth. And I think that's a perspective I really like to use in understanding a lot of social phenomena. But there's only one problem. If you want to experiment with it, it's not possible for me to have thousands or millions of people in the laboratory setting and to run an experiment over and over again. So we run into some fundamental problems of the existing standard social scientific methods. Okay? When you have small laboratory experiments or interviews or some field studies, it's very difficult to immediately get some deeper understanding of how these kinds of theories, these insights apply to a large scale, large society over a long time series. Well, to study that, the methodology of agent-based modeling is becoming increasingly popular. And who has never heard about agent-based modeling yet? For who is this really new? Most of you? Yeah. That's still because it's a method which is not only a new type of method, but it's also because it's rooted in complexity, that it has some more time, there's more time required to have it picked up in science. It's going pretty fast right now. I think the pheromone of the method is spreading very fast right now. And I would like to show you a very simple simulation model, and that's this one. And what we have here is basically the simplest agent-based model, social simulation model you can imagine. This is again the ants. And what we see here is basically the nest, and here's the food. And the ants don't have a representation of the environment. They don't have any cognition at all. They just move until they have a decision to make, either left or right, and they do that by chance. And this is, in this situation, 50-50 chance. and here there's again a choice, and upon return, they also have to make this choice again. But there's one little trick played in this simulation model. The artificial ants, when they walk and they return, they leave artificial pheromone. And this pheromone is being left as a trace on the route. And it affects the chance of other simulated ants to either follow the one route or the other route. The more pheromone there is, the more likely it is that they will follow this route. Now watch what is happening in this situation. So the first one reaches, and of course the fastest one followed the short path by chance. But of course, pheromone is building up faster on the short route because of that. And as a result, because there's more pheromone, it becomes more attractive, and more other artificial ants will follow this route. So without any representation of the environment, without having any cognition of the world, these ants, these simulated ants, are capable, using a very simple rule, to find out an optimal solution without being aware that this is an optimal solution. And that's one of the fascinating things about emergence. Now, the only challenge that we now have is to translate everything we know from psychology and other social science into these agents, right? And make artificial humans. Yeah, let's do that. Well, I've been doing that for almost, I think almost 20 years now. It's fun to do, it's hard to do, but on top of all, it's very interesting to do. And what I've learned is that it's very tempting to make very complicated models of human beings and simulate that. And then you end up with a model you don't understand, because it's way too complicated. On the other hand, you can make a model very simple, sometimes overly simplified, so that the results you obtain from your model do not have really anything to say about the real world. So for me, it's a kind of an art, this moment of balancing the level of complexity of your artificial agents. And basically, what I try to do is to develop models that tell a little bit about what is happening as a phenomenon in the real world. And so it's just a model. And the models are wrong. All models are wrong. Some of them are useful, and I hope the next model will also be a bit useful to help thinking about the dynamics of migration and acculturation. And we started with the idea that in the political discussions, and in the news, there's always a lot of talk about integration, right? Integration this and integration that, and people are not well integrated and blah blah. But what is it exactly? Now, Barry has a very interesting theory on that, and he says, well, integration means that people that are from another culture, when they enter a certain area, that they build up good relations with the indigenous people, but at the same time keep their own culture. Anyone knows an example of a culture in the Netherlands that is integrated? Now we're getting into a kind of sensitive issue, right? Here's where the fun starts.
Indonesians?
Indonesians, yeah. I know a few people from Indonesia. We have, of course, a very troublesome history as colonizing Indonesia. And a group of people from Indonesia, in particular from the Moluccs, they moved to the Netherlands. The idea was to stay temporarily, but not. They stayed here. It was quite problematic in the beginning. There were some train hijacks and shootings going on. If we look at the situation right now, and then look at the people from the Moluccs that I know personally, they are perfectly part of Dutch society, where they work and with who they interact, but still they like to live close to each other, and they have their own traditions, in particular with marriage, for example. Oh man, if you're a father of a daughter who's going to marry, you have to invite, for example, about 1,000 people for a marriage. But it's very important, and it's very meaningful for their society. So that's an example of integration. You also have assimilation. So then you have built up a positive relation with the other group, but a negative one with your own culture. Basically, you lose your own culture and you completely assimilate in the new group. Examples? It's very difficult to spot them, right? When they're completely assimilated. Yeah. One example could be the French Huguenots that escaped from Catholic terror some time ago, and they came to the north, the Protestant north, and they completely merged together with the population over here. And the only way of tracking them in some way or another is by their last name. That's usually a French descendant. Then we have the example of separation, where there's a positive maintenance of the own culture, but the culture of where you come to is not appreciated. And that results in separation. Any example of that in Dutch society?
German Jewish refugees during the Second World
And could you explain? They were very separated?
War. They were put in Westerbork as a refugee camp. They could build it themselves, but they were supposed to stay in one place.
Yeah, but that was ordered top down, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And what I refer to is a situation where people spontaneously
No, they stayed
uh,
separated.
create a situation of separation.
Molenbeek? No?
Sorry?
No. In Belgium, you have like these sort of neighborhoods that are really close. Like
Yeah.
I don't know the name exactly. No.
Oh yes, you can, for example, like do those Arabic
Yeah,
neighborhoods,
yeah.
of people that reject the Western way of life and that are really building up a complete own society, having a negative perspective of other people. That would be a very nice example. Molenbeek is
Yeah, I think it's
the name, of course, of a separation. In a way, you can also see it, for example, I think more in the Turkish community in the Netherlands, which is all quite separated. You have Turkish shops, Turkish soccer clubs, and it's very much separated. And very often people also celebrate their Turkish identity above having a Dutch identity, even for third generation people. Now that's an example of separation between culture. And then you have marginalization. That's one of the most troublesome in the news, where you have migrants that do not have strong connections with their original culture anymore, but they don't have a positive relation with the host culture as well. And then we're talking about often minorities that engage in criminal behavior. They don't fit anymore in their own culture, and they don't have a positive interaction with the culture they're living in right now. And that's very often associated with criminal behavior, for example. Right? Make sense? So, this is what we tried to model in our migration model, and I would like you to start playing around with the model in a few moments. But first of all, let me explain some of the possibilities you have in the model, because it's quite a lot. First, the situation that we have is one of, let's say this is Europe, that's why they're blue, and here, for example, is North Africa, whatever. It's a very stylized model, of course. You can also make Mexico, United States, whatever. Anyway, the migration pressure is going from the right to the left. What you can see is a network between the artificial agents. And this network formation tells a little bit about the acculturation strategy that is happening. And sometimes the agents are very liberal. That means that they're lightly colored in this situation. That expresses a liberal attitude. And liberal agents are more likely, they're more acceptable to have interactions with people from a different culture. They can also become conservative, both over here as well as the red and the green ones. They can become conservative, then they are darker colored, and then they only want to interact with agents of their own group. Now there's a distinction between the red ones and the green ones, and we define the green ones as the legal migrants and the red ones as the illegal migrants. But we can make all kinds of adjustments in the model. Here, for example, the migrants, we can give them more or less resources. We can make them richer or poorer. And we know the poorer they are, the more likely it is that they turn to becoming conservative. We can also change the border over here. This is the border control for the legals and the illegals. And so we can control how many of them, how fast they flow in. And we can even play around with patrols. So you can patrol for illegal migrants. So it's an awful lot for a simple model to play around with. The standard setting, I think, is a good one to start with, and I propose that we are going to play around with the model for a while. You can have a coffee break if you want, and I think in about half an hour or so, I think it would be nice to have a circle and that we discuss a little bit what our experiences are and what you think about if it contributed to your understanding of the dynamics of the situation. Okay?